Picture this. You've spent 8 years building a business from the ground up, turning a struggling family bakery into the most beloved spot in your neighborhood. Your social media following has exploded. Your custom cakes are booked months in advance, and you've personally saved the company from bankruptcy. Then your uncle fires you, calling you redundant, while his unqualified son smirks beside him. What your uncle doesn't know is that you legally own every brick, every oven, and every recipe in that building. He just fired his own boss, and he's about to learn exactly what that means. This is my story of how I went from being treated like disposable help to watching my uncle realize he'd been working for me all along. It's about family betrayal, hidden legal documents, and the sweetest revenge Portland's food scene has ever witnessed. Before we jump into this wild journey, tell me where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if this story touches you or makes you want to stand up and cheer, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and until 3 weeks ago, most people thought I was just another hardworking employee at Rodriguez Family Bakery on Southeast Division Street in Portland, Oregon. The truth is far more complicated, and it started with a promise I made to my dying grandmother 6 years ago. Let me take you back to the beginning. The morning alarm at 3:30 a.m. had become second nature to me. While most of Portland was still deep in sleep, I was already at the bakery, preheating the massive commercial ovens that had been churning out bread since 1963. The familiar weight of my grandmother's old wooden spoons felt like extensions of my own hands as I mixed batters that had been perfected over decades. Rodriguez Family Bakery wasn't just a business to me, it was a living monument to my grandmother Elena's dreams. She'd arrived from Mexico with nothing but a sourdough starter wrapped in her mother's shawl and a determination to feed her new community. Every morning when I unlocked those glass doors with their hand-painted signs, I felt her presence guiding my hands as I shaped queta concha and rolled each empanada. The neighborhood had changed dramatically since Grandma Elena first opened her doors. Southeast Division had transformed from a quiet residential street into Portland's hottest food destination. Trendy restaurants and artisanal coffee shops commanded premium rents, and developers circled like vultures, offering ridiculous sums for the vintage buildings that housed longtime family businesses. Through it all, our little bakery had not just survived but thrived, becoming an anchor that kept the soul of the neighborhood intact. I'd been working at the bakery since I was 16, starting with simple tasks like sweeping floors and restocking napkin dispensers. Grandma Elena taught me everything personally, from the exact temperature needed for perfect flan to the secret ingredient that made our tres leches cake legendary among Portland's growing Latino community. She never treated my learning as casual summer job training. Instead, she spoke to me like I was inheriting a legacy, which I now realize was exactly what she intended. When I graduated from Portland State with a business degree, everyone expected me to move on to some corporate job downtown. Instead, I chose to stay and help modernize the bakery while preserving everything that made it special. I convinced Grandma Elena to let me start an Instagram account, and within months we had thousands of followers watching my behind-the-scenes videos of traditional baking techniques. Our weekend empanada pop-ups became legendary, with lines stretching around the block. The business side fascinated me as much as the baking. I redesigned our point-of-sale system, negotiated better terms with suppliers, and created partnerships with local coffee roasters and restaurants. When food trucks started dominating Portland's lunch scene, I convinced the family to let me start our own mobile operation. The bright yellow truck with Abuela Elena's painted and flowing script became a familiar sight at downtown office buildings and weekend farmers markets. But perhaps my greatest achievement was saving us from the crisis that nearly destroyed everything 3 years ago. A massive chain bakery had opened directly across the street, undercutting our prices and staying open 24 hours. Our foot traffic dropped by 60% almost overnight. Family meetings became tense affairs, with some relatives suggesting we sell the building while property values were still high. I refused to give up. Working 18-hour days, I launched our catering division, specializing in authentic Mexican pastries for weddings and corporate events. I created exclusive wholesale partnerships with 3 upscale grocery chains, getting our products into stores across the metro area. Most importantly, I leveraged our social media following to launch online ordering, shipping our signature items nationwide. Within 18 months, we weren't just surviving the competition, we were thriving despite it. Through all of this growth and innovation, my Uncle Roberto had been the official manager. He'd stepped into that role when Grandma Elena's arthritis made daily operations difficult for her. Roberto was a good man, but his business philosophy belonged to a different era. He believed in keeping things simple, maintaining the status quo, and avoiding risks. While I pushed for expansion and modernization, he often seemed uncomfortable with change. The family dynamics were complex. Roberto was Grandma Elena's oldest son, and traditional Mexican family structure suggested he should lead the business. But he'd spent most of his career working construction, only joining the bakery full-time when Grandma's health declined. His son Carlos had recently graduated from business school and was eager to apply his theoretical knowledge to what he saw as an outdated family operation. Roberto treated me with affection, but always as his niece rather than a business partner. When customers praised innovations I'd implemented, he accepted the credit graciously. When reporters wrote articles about our successful adaptation to changing neighborhoods, he posed for photos as the face of the family business. I didn't mind initially, assuming that family harmony was more important than individual recognition. What I didn't realize was how this dynamic appeared to everyone else. To our employees, vendors, and even some family members, I was Roberto's enthusiastic assistant rather than the architect of our transformation. The carefully crafted social media presence, the successful catering contracts, the online ordering system that generated 40% of our revenue. All these accomplishments were attributed to Roberto's leadership, rather than my specific contributions. The morning shifts became my sanctuary. In those quiet hours before the neighborhood awakened, I was completely in control. I developed new recipes that honored traditional techniques while appealing to Portland's adventurous food culture. My lavender honey empanadas had become so popular that food bloggers made pilgrimages from Seattle just to try them. The seasonal specials I created, like pumpkin spice conchas in October and peppermint chocolate tres leches during the holidays, generated social media buzz that kept our name trending locally. I'd also become the unofficial curator of Grandma Elena's legacy. I organized her handwritten recipes, translated them into precise measurements for consistency, and documented the stories behind each traditional item. This wasn't just preservation. It was active cultural work that connected our growing diverse customer base to the history and meaning behind what they were eating. The financial transformation was equally dramatic. When I'd started managing the books, our monthly revenue barely covered basic expenses. By implementing modern inventory management, strategic pricing, and diverse revenue streams, I'd increased our monthly income by 300%. The building that once barely generated enough rent to cover itself was now worth nearly $2 million, and the business had become profitable enough to support the entire extended family. Yet despite all these contributions, I remained officially just another employee. My paychecks came from the business account, but I had no formal ownership stake, no decision-making authority, and no guarantee that my innovations wouldn't be dismantled if family leadership changed. I told myself this arrangement was temporary, that eventually Roberto would recognize my contributions and offer me a partnership role. Grandma Elena saw things differently. During her final months, when pain medication made her unusually direct, she started expressing concerns about the family's future. She worried that Roberto, despite his good intentions, didn't truly understand what I'd built. She fretted that Carlos, with his business school confidence and complete lack of hands-on experience, might make changes that would destroy the delicate balance between tradition and innovation that had made us successful. Her most pointed concern was about respect. She'd lived through decades of watching capable women have their contributions minimized or erased entirely. She'd seen too many family businesses torn apart by assumptions about who deserved credit and who deserved control. She wasn't going to let that happen to her life's work or to me. The conversations we had during her final weeks were unlike anything we'd shared before. Sitting beside her hospital bed, she spoke about legacy and protection, about the difference between managing something and truly owning it. She talked about her regrets, particularly her decision to step back from active leadership too early, allowing others to shape the narrative about who deserved recognition for the bakery's success. Most importantly, she began hinting at arrangements she'd made to protect both the business and my future role in it. At the time, I thought these were the rambling concerns of someone facing mortality. I assumed she was worried about family harmony and wanted reassurance that we'd all continue working together. I had no idea she was actually describing specific legal steps she'd already taken. The neighborhood itself had become part of my identity. Southeast Division's transformation from overlooked residential street to culinary destination had happened alongside my own growth from teenager to business leader. I knew every shop owner, every regular customer, every community leader who worked to preserve the area's character while embracing positive change. Our bakery had become a gathering place where longtime residents mixed with newcomers, where traditional Mexican families celebrated alongside young professionals, discovering authentic flavors for the first time. This integration with the community had always been one of my proudest achievements. I'd organized Dia de los Muertos celebrations that brought hundreds of people together. I'd partnered with local schools to teach traditional baking classes. I'd created scholarship programs for Latino students pursuing culinary careers. These weren't just marketing initiatives. They were expressions of my belief that businesses should serve their communities in ways that extended far beyond simple transactions. The social media presence I'd built reflected this community connection.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Our Instagram account didn't just showcase beautiful food photography. It told stories about ingredients, traditions, and the people who made our success possible. I featured employees, highlighted customer celebrations, and shared the history behind traditional recipes. This authentic storytelling had created a loyal following that went far beyond typical food accounts. By the time Roberto called that fateful meeting 3 weeks ago, I'd spent 8 years building something extraordinary. I'd taken a struggling neighborhood bakery and transformed it into a thriving business that honored tradition while embracing innovation. I'd created jobs, supported community initiatives, and preserved cultural heritage while generating real economic success. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly that success could be redefined by someone who'd never understood my role in creating it. I was about to learn that years of quiet contribution, countless hours of unpaid innovation, and unwavering family loyalty meant nothing when power dynamics shifted and egos took control. The morning Roberto asked me to meet him in the office above the bakery, I had no idea I was about to be dismissed from the business I'd spent nearly a decade building. I couldn't have imagined that within hours, I'd be walking out of that building, carrying only my personal recipe notebook, my grandmother's wooden spoons, and a business card for the lawyer who'd helped arrange the most important transaction of my life. Most shocking of all, I had no idea that Roberto was about to fire his own boss. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, right after the lunch rush had died down. Roberto had been acting strangely for weeks, having hushed conversations with Carlos that stopped whenever I entered the room. I'd assumed they were planning some kind of surprise, maybe finally offering me the partnership role I'd been hoping for. The bakery's success had been impossible to ignore, and I thought perhaps they were ready to formalize my contributions. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the office above the main floor, the same stairs Grandma Elena had climbed thousands of times during her 40 years of leadership. The office itself was cramped and outdated, filled with mismatched furniture and filing cabinets that hadn't been organized properly in decades. Sunlight filtered through dust-covered windows, illuminating stacks of invoices and order forms that I'd been gradually digitizing during my spare time. Roberto sat behind the old metal desk that had belonged to my grandfather, his expression more serious than I'd seen in months. Carlos occupied the folding chair beside him, dressed in one of his expensive business suits that looked completely out of place in our humble surroundings. Something about their positioning felt formal, almost confrontational, and my stomach began to tighten with unexpected anxiety. The conversation started with pleasantries about the morning's sales figures and an upcoming catering order for a wedding reception. Roberto seemed nervous, fidgeting with a pen and avoiding direct eye contact. Carlos, on the other hand, appeared confident and prepared, like someone who'd rehearsed his role in whatever was about to unfold. Then Roberto cleared his throat and launched into what was obviously a prepared speech. He talked about changing market conditions, evolving customer expectations, and the need for fresh perspectives in family businesses. His words felt hollow and scripted, lacking the warmth and authenticity that usually characterized our family conversations. The blow came without warning. Roberto announced that they'd decided to restructure the bakery's management team. Carlos would be taking over daily operations, implementing modern business practices and strategic planning initiatives. My role, Roberto explained with obvious discomfort, was being eliminated as part of this restructuring effort. The words hit me like cold water. 8 years of building, innovating, and growing this business, and I was being told my position was unnecessary. Roberto tried to soften the impact by emphasizing how much the family appreciated my contributions, and suggesting that perhaps I could find a fulfilling career opportunity elsewhere, maybe even in the corporate world where my business degree would be more applicable. Carlos finally spoke, his tone patronizingly professional. He explained that his analysis had identified several inefficiencies in our current operations. The social media presence I'd built, while charming, wasn't generating quantifiable return on investment. The catering division, despite its profitability, was distracting from our core neighborhood bakery mission. The online ordering system was overly complicated and created unnecessary overhead costs. I listened in stunned silence as he systematically dismissed every innovation I'd implemented. According to his assessment, the bakery needed to return to its roots, focusing on simple neighborhood service rather than attempting to compete in Portland's oversaturated artisanal food market. He'd already identified cost-saving measures that would improve our profit margins while reducing operational complexity. When I finally found my voice, I asked specific questions about their plans. Who would manage the vendor relationships I'd spent years cultivating? How would they maintain the quality standards I'd established for our wholesale accounts? What would happen to the employees who'd been trained in the specialized techniques required for our signature items? Carlos answered with the kind of generic business school responses that revealed his complete lack of understanding about our actual operations. He talked about streamlining processes, optimizing workflows, and leveraging core competencies. When I pressed for concrete details, he became defensive, suggesting that my attachment to current procedures was preventing me from seeing the bigger picture. Roberto attempted to mediate, emphasizing that this wasn't personal but rather a necessary business decision. The family had discussed the situation extensively, he claimed, and everyone agreed that bringing in fresh leadership was essential for long-term success. He assured me that my contributions would always be remembered and appreciated, but it was time for the next generation to take control. The patronizing tone was unmistakable. They were speaking to me like a child who needed to accept adult decisions gracefully. The business I'd rebuilt from near bankruptcy was being described as if it were a struggling operation that required rescue from my misguided management. The community relationships I'd fostered, the brand recognition I'd developed, the financial growth I'd generated, all of it was being reframed as obstacles to overcome rather than achievements to build upon. I realized that arguing would be pointless. Their minds were made up, and they'd clearly convinced themselves that this transition was not only necessary but overdue. The narrative they'd constructed painted me as someone who'd done her best, but lacked the vision and expertise needed for serious business leadership. In their version of events, Carlos represented progress and professionalism, while I represented outdated sentimentality and amateur enthusiasm. The conversation concluded with practical details about my departure. I would have 2 weeks to train Carlos on essential procedures, though he seemed confident that his business background would enable him to master most operations quickly. My final paycheck would include a small bonus as recognition for my years of service. Roberto emphasized that this transition was temporary, suggesting that perhaps I could return in some capacity once Carlos had established his leadership. I gathered my things methodically, maintaining the composure that had served me well throughout my life. My grandmother's wooden spoons went into my bag alongside the leather-bound notebook, where I'd recorded recipe modifications and customer preferences. I collected the few personal items I'd accumulated over 8 years, including photographs from community events and thank you cards from satisfied catering clients. Walking down those narrow stairs for what I assumed was the last time, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Anger was certainly present, but it was tempered by disappointment and genuine sadness. This wasn't just about losing a job. It was about having my identity and contributions erased by people who'd never truly understood what I'd accomplished. The main bakery floor was busy with afternoon customers, many of whom greeted me warmly and asked about their favorite seasonal items. These were people who knew me by name, who'd watched me grow from teenager to young adult, who'd supported my innovations and celebrated our shared successes. I realized that Carlos had no relationship with these customers, and no understanding of the personal connections that made our business more than just another retail operation. Maria, our head decorator, noticed my expression and asked if everything was okay. I managed to smile and assured her that changes were coming but that everything would work out fine. I couldn't bring myself to explain what had just happened, partly because I was still processing it myself, and partly because I didn't want to create unnecessary drama for the employees who would have to continue working under the new management. The drive home was a blur of conflicting thoughts and emotions. I kept replaying the conversation, searching for signs I'd missed that might have prepared me for this outcome. Roberto's nervousness, Carlos's recent presence around the bakery, the family discussions I'd been excluded from all the pieces, seemed obvious in retrospect, but they'd been invisible to me while I was focused on daily operations and future planning. My apartment felt strangely quiet after the constant activity of bakery life. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the business cards and vendor contact lists I'd collected over the years, wondering what would happen to the relationships I'd built and the projects I'd been developing. The food truck schedule for the following month, the new wholesale accounts I'd been negotiating, the holiday menu I'd been planning, all of it would now be Carlos's responsibility, assuming he understood its importance. The more I thought about the situation, the more surreal it became. I'd been fired from a business I'd essentially rebuilt, dismissed by people who'd had minimal involvement in its transformation. The financial systems I'd implemented, the vendor relationships I'd cultivated, the brand recognition I'd developed, all of it would continue generating value, but I'd receive no ongoing benefit or recognition for my contributions. Later that evening, I called my friend Jessica, who'd been my study partner in business school and now worked as a marketing manager for a tech startup downtown. I needed to talk through what had happened with someone who understood both family dynamics and business realities. Jessica listened patiently as I recounted the meeting, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just letting me process the experience verbally. Her perspective was illuminating. From the outside, she could see patterns that I'd been too close to recognize. The gradual marginalization of my role, the exclusion from strategic discussions, the attribution of my successes to Roberto's leadership. All of these were classic signs of someone being positioned for removal. She'd seen similar situations in corporate environments, where capable employees were systematically undermined before being eliminated. Jessica also helped me understand the gender and generational dynamics at play. Carlos represented traditional male authority and formal business education, while I represented intuitive female leadership and experiential learning. In many family business situations, these cultural biases operated below the surface, influencing decisions in ways that weren't explicitly acknowledged but were nonetheless determinative. The conversation with Jessica was therapeutic but also frustrating. Understanding the systemic issues that had contributed to my dismissal didn't change the immediate reality of being unemployed and effectively erased from the business I'd built. Knowledge about gender bias in family enterprises wasn't going to pay my rent or restore my professional identity. That night, I lay awake thinking about Grandma Elena and what she would have said about this situation. She'd faced countless challenges as a Mexican immigrant woman trying to establish a business in a predominantly white neighborhood during the 1960s. She'd dealt with discrimination, financial struggles, and family conflicts throughout her decades of leadership. Her strength had always come from her refusal to accept other people's limitations on her capabilities. I remembered conversations we'd had during my teenage years about the importance of documentation and legal protection. She'd often said that good intentions weren't enough in business relationships, that even family members needed clear agreements and formal structures to prevent misunderstandings. At the time, I'd thought she was being overly cautious or pessimistic about human nature. Now I was beginning to understand that her caution had been wisdom earned through hard experience. Family businesses were particularly vulnerable to emotional conflicts and power struggles that could destroy both relationships and enterprises. The informal arrangements that seemed natural and trusting could become sources of confusion and resentment when circumstances changed. I also thought about the employees who'd become friends and colleagues over the years. Maria had been with us since before I'd started working full-time, and she'd supported many of my innovations while teaching me traditional techniques I couldn't have learned anywhere else. The part-time staff included several students who depended on their bakery income to support their education. The delivery drivers who served our catering clients had become part of our extended family. Under Carlos's leadership, would these relationships survive? Would he understand the personal connections that made our workplace more than just a business operation? Would he maintain the employee benefits I'd gradually implemented, like flexible scheduling for students and performance bonuses during busy seasons? The more I considered these questions, the more worried I became about the human impact of this transition. The following morning brought a new perspective on my situation. Instead of focusing on what I'd lost, I began thinking about what I'd learned and what opportunities might be available. 8 years of business experience, particularly in a successful family enterprise, had provided me with skills and knowledge that could be applied in many different contexts. My understanding of community engagement, brand development, and operational efficiency could be valuable to other organizations. I also realized that being forced out of the bakery might actually be a blessing in disguise. I'd been so focused on preserving and building upon Grandma Elena's legacy that I'd never seriously considered what my own independent vision might look like. Perhaps this was an opportunity to explore entrepreneurial possibilities that had been impossible while I was committed to the family business. But even as I tried to maintain an optimistic outlook, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was being lost. The bakery represented more than just a business or even a family legacy. It was a community institution that connected people across cultural and generational lines. My innovations had strengthened those connections while honoring traditional values. Carlos's planned changes seemed likely to diminish both the cultural authenticity and community engagement that made our bakery special. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. I continued working my shifts, training Carlos on procedures he seemed confident he could improve, and watching the business operate as if nothing fundamental had changed. Customers continued asking about special orders and seasonal items, unaware that the person they were speaking with would soon have no authority to fulfill their requests. Carlos approached this training period with obvious impatience. He took notes perfunctorily and frequently interrupted my explanations to suggest more efficient alternatives. When I tried to explain the reasoning behind certain procedures or the history behind specific recipes, he dismissed these details as unnecessary complications. His focus was entirely on immediate operational mechanics, with no interest in the cultural knowledge or relationship-building aspects of the work. The contrast between our approaches became increasingly apparent, where I saw each customer interaction as an opportunity to strengthen community connections. Carlos saw transactions to be processed efficiently. Where I viewed recipe traditions as cultural heritage to be preserved and shared, he saw outdated procedures that could be streamlined. Where I understood vendor relationships as partnerships built on mutual respect and reliability, he saw contractual arrangements that could be optimized for cost savings. By the end of the first week, it was clear that Carlos intended to implement changes far more radical than anything Roberto had suggested during our initial meeting. He'd already contacted suppliers about reducing ingredient quality to improve profit margins. He'd questioned the necessity of several part-time positions that provided flexibility during busy periods. Most concerning, he'd suggested that our traditional Day of the Dead celebration was too expensive and culturally specific for our increasingly diverse customer base. These revelations crystallized my understanding of what was really happening. This wasn't just a management transition or a generational change in leadership style. This was a fundamental transformation of the bakery's identity and mission. The community-centered, culturally grounded approach that had been central to our success was being replaced by a generic profit maximization strategy that could have been applied to any retail business. I began documenting everything I could about our current operations, partly to ensure a complete handover, but mostly because I suspected this information might become important later. Customer preferences, vendor specifications, employee schedules, seasonal planning details, community event commitments. All of it went into detailed notes that captured not just procedures, but also the reasoning and relationships behind them. Something Grandma Elena had said during our final conversations kept echoing in my mind. She'd talked about the difference between managing something and truly owning it. about the importance of legal documentation and formal agreements even within families. At the time, I'd assumed she was speaking generally about business principles. Now I wondered if she'd been trying to tell me something specific about arrangements she'd made. The thought was intriguing, but also frustrating. Even if Grandma Elena had made special provisions for my future involvement in the bakery, what good would they do now? Roberto was her son, and the obvious heir to family business leadership. Any informal promises or sentimental gestures would be meaningless in the face of practical family authority and business necessity. Still, as I prepared for my final week at the bakery, I found myself thinking more and more about the legal documents Grandma Elena had insisted on creating during her final months. She'd been surprisingly energetic about updating wills, business registrations, and property records, working with her longtime lawyer despite her declining health. I'd accompanied her to several of these meetings, but I'd assumed they were routine end-of-life administrative tasks rather than strategic planning initiatives. Perhaps it was time to find out exactly what arrangements my grandmother had made, and whether any of them might be relevant to my current situation. At the very least, understanding the legal structure of the business might help me process what had happened and plan for whatever came next. At most, I might discover that Grandma Elena's final months had been more strategic than anyone realized. The drive to Grandma Elena's lawyer's office took me through the heart of Southeast Portland, past the familiar landmarks that had shaped my understanding of community and belonging. Morrison and Associates occupied a modest building on Hawthorne Boulevard, the kind of established professional practice that had served immigrant families for generations. I'd been here several times during Grandma Elena's final months, but always as her companion and translator, never as someone seeking legal guidance for my own situation. Patricia Morrison had been Grandma Elena's attorney for over 20 years, handling everything from business registrations to immigration paperwork for extended family members. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that had witnessed countless family dramas and business disputes. When I called requesting an appointment to discuss my grandmother's estate documents, she'd immediately agreed to see me, though her tone suggested she knew more about my current circumstances than I'd explained over the phone. Her office reflected decades of dedicated service to Portland's Latino community. The walls displayed certificates in both English and Spanish, photographs from community celebrations, and thank you letters from grateful clients. A large wooden crucifix hung behind her desk alongside diplomas from Lewis and Clark Law School and the University of Mexico. The space felt simultaneously professional and familial, much like the bakery itself. Patricia greeted me with genuine warmth, offering condolences about my recent departure from the family business. Apparently, news traveled quickly through Portland's tight-knit Mexican-American community, and she'd already heard about Roberto's decision to install Carlos as the new manager. Her expression suggested sympathy, but also something else, a knowing look that implied she'd been expecting this conversation. I explained my situation honestly, describing the meeting with Roberto and Carlos, my shock at being dismissed, and my growing curiosity about any arrangements Grandma Elena might have made regarding the bakery's future. I emphasized that I wasn't looking for ways to create family conflict, but I wanted to understand exactly what my grandmother had intended, and whether any of her final wishes were relevant to my current circumstances. Patricia listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the timeline of events and the specific language Roberto had used during our meeting. When I finished my account, she was quiet for several moments, studying a thick file folder that had been sitting on her desk since I'd arrived. Finally, she looked up with an expression that mixed professional caution with something approaching excitement. She began by explaining that Grandma Elena had indeed made very specific arrangements regarding the bakery, arrangements that went far beyond typical estate planning. During her final months, when her arthritis made daily operations increasingly difficult, she'd become concerned about the future leadership of the business she'd built. She'd observed the family dynamics carefully and had grown worried about what might happen to both the enterprise and my role within it. According to Patricia, Grandma Elena had been particularly troubled by Roberto's lack of engagement with the bakery's transformation. While he'd been content to serve as the nominal manager, accepting credit for successes he hadn't created, she'd watched me assume increasingly vital responsibilities without receiving corresponding recognition or authority. She'd also been concerned about Carlos's apparent sense of entitlement, despite his complete lack of experience in food service or community engagement. The legal arrangements Grandma Elena had made were both simple and brilliant. Rather than leaving the bakery to Roberto through her will, which would have been the traditional approach, she decided to sell the business during her lifetime to ensure her intentions were clearly documented and legally protected. The transaction had been structured to appear like a routine family transfer, but the actual details were far more strategic than anyone realized. Patricia opened the file folder and withdrew a document I recognized but had never read carefully. It was the purchase agreement I'd signed during one of our visits to this office, a transaction I'd assumed was purely ceremonial. Grandma Elena had insisted that I needed to buy the bakery from her for legal purposes, and I'd agreed without fully understanding the implications. The purchase price had been deliberately set at $1, making the transaction seem like a formality rather than a genuine transfer of ownership. But the document Patricia showed me was comprehensive and legally binding. I had indeed purchased Rodriguez Family Bakery in its entirety, including all equipment, recipes, trademarks, vendor relationships, and real estate. The building that housed our operations, the commercial kitchen equipment that had been accumulated over decades, even the hand-painted signs that had become neighborhood landmarks, all of it legally belonged to me. The arrangement included a detailed management agreement that had allowed Roberto to continue operating the business on my behalf. This agreement specified his responsibilities, compensation, and the conditions under which his management role could be terminated. Most importantly, it included clear language stating that any major changes to business operations, staffing, or strategic direction required my explicit written approval as the owner. I stared at the documents in stunned silence, trying to process what Patricia was telling me. For 6 years, I'd been working in my own business, taking direction from someone who was actually my employee, and watching my achievements be attributed to a manager who served at my discretion. The arrangement had been designed to preserve family harmony while protecting my legal interests, but I'd been too trusting and too focused on daily operations to assert my actual authority. Patricia explained that Grandma Elena had structured the arrangement this way specifically to avoid the kind of situation I was now facing. She'd wanted me to have ultimate control over the business I'd essentially rebuilt, but she'd also wanted to give Roberto the dignity and respect that came with apparent leadership. The expectation had been that over time, as my contributions became undeniable, the family would naturally recognize my true role, and the formal ownership structure would become irrelevant. What Grandma Elena hadn't anticipated was that Roberto would eventually decide to exclude me from the business entirely. The management agreement she'd crafted had been designed to prevent major changes without my consent, but it had never occurred to her that Roberto might try to fire me from my own company. This oversight had created a surreal situation where I'd been dismissed from a business I legally owned by someone who had no authority to make such decisions. The implications were staggering. Every innovation I'd implemented, every vendor relationship I'd developed, every dollar of revenue the bakery generated, all of it had been accomplished in my capacity as the legal owner, even though I hadn't realized it at the time. The social media accounts I'd built, the catering contracts I'd negotiated, the wholesale partnerships I'd established, all of these were assets of a company I owned, rather than contributions to someone else's business. Patricia also revealed additional aspects of Grandma Elena's planning that I'd been unaware of. The bank accounts associated with the bakery's operations had been restructured to list me as the primary account holder, with Roberto having signing authority but not ownership control. The business licenses and permits that allowed us to operate legally were registered in my name. Even the liability insurance that protected us from potential lawsuits listed me as the policyholder and primary beneficiary. Most significantly, the building that housed Rodriguez Family Bakery had been included in the sale transaction. I owned not just the business operations but also the real estate that had become increasingly valuable as Southeast Division transformed into one of Portland's most desirable commercial districts. Property values in the area had more than doubled since Grandma Elena's death, meaning that my $1 purchase had acquired assets now worth well over $2 million. The revelation was overwhelming, I'd gone from unemployed former employee to business owner and property holder in the span of a single conversation. But the emotional impact was even more profound than the financial implications. Grandma Elena had seen my potential and my vulnerability with equal clarity, and she'd taken concrete steps to protect both. The legal arrangements she'd created were expressions of love and confidence that went far beyond anything I'd understood at the time. Patricia explained that there had been practical reasons for keeping the ownership structure confidential initially. Grandma Elena had been concerned about potential family conflicts if Roberto learned that he was serving as a manager rather than an inheritor. She'd also been worried about possible resentment from other family members who might feel that I'd received unfair advantages due to my close relationship with her. The plan had been to gradually reveal the true ownership structure as I gained confidence and experience in business leadership. But Grandma Elena's declining health had prevented these conversations from taking place. By the time her condition became critical, she'd been more focused on ensuring that the legal arrangements were properly documented than on explaining their full implications to me. She'd trusted that Patricia would guide me through the details when the time came, though she'd probably hoped that moment would arise under less dramatic circumstances. The management agreement that had governed Roberto's role included specific provisions for situations like the one I was currently facing. If Roberto made decisions that were contrary to my interests as the owner, or if he attempted to exclude me from business operations, I had the right to terminate his management role immediately. The document even included language about compensation for wrongful termination, suggesting that Grandma Elena had anticipated the possibility of conflicts arising from family dynamics and power struggles. Patricia also revealed that Grandma Elena had left detailed instructions about how to handle various scenarios that might threaten the business or my position within it. She'd been particularly concerned about the possibility that Roberto might try to sell the business or property without understanding its true value or my role in creating that value. The legal structure she'd created made any such sale impossible without my consent, regardless of Roberto's intentions or assumptions about his authority. As I absorbed this information, I began to understand that every challenge I'd faced over the past few years had been anticipated and addressed by my grandmother's careful planning. The vendor relationships I'd worried about losing were actually contracts with my company. The employee relationships I'd valued were actually my responsibility as the business owner. The community connections I'd feared might be damaged by Carlos's leadership were actually assets I could protect through my legal authority. The social media presence that Carlos had dismissed as inefficient was actually a valuable marketing asset belonging to my business. The catering division he planned to eliminate was actually a profitable revenue stream that I could maintain or expand as I saw fit. The online ordering system he considered unnecessarily complicated was actually intellectual property I developed for my own company. Every innovation he planned to reverse was actually my decision to make as the business owner. Patricia walked me through the practical steps I could take to assert my ownership rights. The first priority was to notify Roberto formally that his management agreement was being terminated due to his violation of its terms. This notification needed to be delivered in writing and include specific references to the sections of the agreement he'd violated by attempting to exclude me from business operations. The termination would be effective immediately, restoring my direct control over all aspects of the business. She also explained that I had the right to seek compensation for any damages caused by Roberto's unauthorized decisions during the period when he'd exceeded his management authority. This could include any contracts he'd modified without my approval, any employee changes he'd implemented contrary to my interests, and any business opportunities he'd declined that might have benefited the company. The financial implications could be substantial, particularly if Carlos had already begun implementing his cost-cutting measures. The conversation with Patricia lasted nearly 3 hours, as we reviewed every document in Grandma Elena's file and discussed the various options available to me. By the time I left her office, I had copies of all the relevant paperwork, a clear understanding of my legal rights, and a detailed plan for reclaiming control of my business. But I also had something more valuable, a profound appreciation for my grandmother's wisdom and love. Driving home, I thought about all the conversations Grandma Elena and I had shared during her final months. Comments that had seemed like general business advice now revealed themselves as specific guidance about the responsibilities I'd be assuming. Questions she'd asked about my long-term goals now appeared to be ways of ensuring that her planning aligned with my actual interests and capabilities. Even her insistence that I learn traditional recipes and techniques had been part of preparing me for eventual ownership rather than just cultural preservation. I also began to understand why she'd been so insistent about documentation and record-keeping during my years at the bakery. Every email I'd saved, every photograph I'd taken of our events and celebrations, every receipt I'd organized for tax purposes, all of it was actually documentation of my ownership and management of the business. The meticulous records I'd maintained weren't just good business practices. They were evidence of my legitimate authority and ongoing involvement in every aspect of the company's operations. The financial records I'd maintained told a clear story of transformation and growth under my leadership. The customer database I'd built demonstrated the community relationships I'd fostered. The vendor contracts I'd negotiated showed my ability to create mutually beneficial business partnerships. The employee training programs I'd developed proved my commitment to building a sustainable organization rather than just generating short-term profits. Most importantly, I realized that the cultural preservation work I'd done wasn't just personally meaningful, it was also strategically valuable. The traditional recipes I'd documented, the community relationships I'd nurtured, the authentic atmosphere I'd maintained, all of these elements had created competitive advantages that would be difficult for any other business to replicate. Carlos's plans to eliminate these aspects of our operations weren't just culturally insensitive. They were economically short-sighted. That evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by legal documents, business records, and family photographs, trying to fully grasp the transformation in my circumstances. Less than a week ago, I'd been a dismissed employee with an uncertain future. Now I was the owner of a successful business and valuable real estate, with the legal authority to determine both my own role and the future direction of an enterprise I'd spent years building. The emotional impact was as significant as the practical implications. For years, I'd felt grateful for the opportunity to work at the family bakery, treating my position as a privilege rather than a right. I'd accepted credit being given to others for my achievements, assuming that family harmony was more important than individual recognition. I'd deferred to Roberto's authority even when I disagreed with his decisions, believing that respect for elders required submission rather than collaboration. Now I understood that these attitudes, while culturally appropriate in many contexts, had actually prevented me from claiming my legitimate role as a business leader. Grandma Elena had created legal structures that protected my interests, but she'd also expected me to use those protections when necessary. My reluctance to assert myself had allowed a situation to develop where my own employee was attempting to fire me from my own business. The irony was almost overwhelming. Roberto had dismissed me for being insufficiently businesslike and professional, unaware that he was actually violating his employment agreement with me. Carlos had criticized my management decisions as amateurish and inefficient, not realizing that he was actually criticizing the owner of the company he hoped to run. Both of them had assumed that formal business education and traditional gender roles were more important than documented legal ownership and proven operational success. Tomorrow I would begin the process of reclaiming my business and asserting my authority as its legitimate owner. But tonight I simply sat with the profound gratitude I felt toward a grandmother who had loved me enough to anticipate challenges I couldn't have imagined and wise enough to create solutions that protected both my interests and my dignity. The wooden spoons she'd given me, which I'd carried home as sentimental keepsakes, now seemed like symbols of legitimate inheritance rather than nostalgic mementos. The recipes I'd learned at her side weren't just cultural knowledge, they were trade secrets of a business I owned. The community relationships she'd modeled for me weren't just personal values, they were professional assets that belonged to my company. Grandma Elena had given me far more than a business or even financial security. She'd given me the legal foundation for independence and the practical tools for success. Most importantly, she demonstrated that love sometimes required strategic thinking, and that protecting someone you care about might involve arrangements they wouldn't understand until they were ready to benefit from them. As I prepared for what would undoubtedly be difficult conversations with Roberto and Carlos, I felt a confidence that had been missing from my life for years. I wasn't just a talented employee fighting for recognition. I was a business owner reclaiming control of her own company. I wasn't just defending my contributions. I was asserting my legitimate authority. The transformation from dismissed worker to empowered owner had happened in a single afternoon, but it had been 6 years in the making. The morning I walked back into Rodriguez Family Bakeries as its legal owner felt like stepping into a parallel universe. The familiar sounds of ovens humming and coffee brewing remained the same, but everything else had fundamentally shifted. I no longer heard these sounds as background noise from someone else's workplace. Now they represented the operations of my business, my responsibility, my legacy to protect and nurture. I'd spent the previous 3 days preparing for this moment with Patricia's guidance. Every document had been reviewed, every legal precedent examined, every possible response from Roberto and Carlos anticipated. The certified letter terminating Roberto's management agreement had been delivered to his home address the evening before. By the time I arrived at 7 in the morning, he would have already read the official notification that his employment was ended and his authority revoked. The early morning shift was just beginning when I unlocked the front door with the keys I'd never returned. Maria looked up from arranging pastries in the display case, her expression shifting from confusion to relief when she saw me. The other early employees gathered around, asking questions I couldn't fully answer yet. All I could tell them was that there had been some misunderstandings about business ownership that were now being resolved, and that their jobs were secure under my leadership. Roberto arrived 15 minutes later, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. He clutched the termination letter in one hand and his phone in the other, clearly having spent the early morning hours trying to reach Patricia or find some legal loophole that would invalidate what he'd read. The moment he saw me standing behind the counter in my apron, directing the morning prep work, his composure cracked completely. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced with family. Roberto's voice rose to levels that made customers in the neighboring shops turn their heads. He accused me of betrayal, manipulation, and legal trickery. He claimed that Grandma Elena must have been mentally incompetent when she'd signed the ownership transfer documents. He threatened to contest the sale in court, and to expose what he called my conspiracy to steal the family business. Through it all, I maintained the calm professionalism that Patricia had coached me to display. Every accusation Roberto made only demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of the legal arrangements that had been in place for 6 years. Every threat he issued revealed his assumption that emotional outbursts could override documented legal ownership. Every demand he made for explanations showed his inability to accept that his management role had always been conditional on my approval as the business owner. Carlos arrived during the height of Roberto's tirade, having been summoned by increasingly frantic phone calls. His reaction was different, but equally revealing. Instead of explosive anger, he displayed the kind of cold calculation I'd seen during our training sessions. He immediately began questioning the validity of documents he'd never seen, suggesting that any ownership transfer must have involved elder abuse or undue influence. His business school training had taught him to look for weaknesses in legal arguments, but it hadn't prepared him for the reality of comprehensive estate planning executed by experienced attorneys. The scene playing out in the bakery's main room was drawing attention from early customers and neighboring business owners. Several regular customers approached me directly, asking if everything was all right and expressing their support for my leadership. Ly dynamics were complex. Their comments revealed something Roberto and Carlos hadn't anticipated. The community had always seen me as the heart of the bakery's operations, regardless of official titles or family hierarchies. Mrs. Chen, who'd been buying our bread for 20 years, spoke directly to Roberto while I was preparing her usual order. She told him that his niece was the reason the bakery had survived and thrived, and that any family that couldn't recognize her contributions didn't deserve her loyalty. Mr. Gonzalez, whose construction crew had catered lunch from us twice a week for 5 years, announced loudly that he'd follow my baking wherever I went, because Carlos's trial samples had been inferior to what I'd always provided. These spontaneous testimonials from loyal customers highlighted another dimension of the business that Roberto and Carlos had never fully understood. The community relationships I'd built weren't just marketing strategies or customer service techniques. They were genuine connections based on consistent quality, cultural authenticity, and personal respect. These relationships belonged to me personally, not to the business entity, and they represented competitive advantages that couldn't be replicated through cost-cutting measures or efficiency improvements. Patricia arrived at 9 o'clock, having anticipated that Roberto might create a public disturbance that required legal intervention. Her presence immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation. Roberto's threats to contest the ownership documents lost their power when faced with the attorney who drafted them. Carlos's questions about legal procedures received detailed answers that revealed the comprehensive planning behind every aspect of the transfer. The conversation moved to the office upstairs, where Patricia methodically addressed every concern Roberto and Carlos raised. She produced copies of all relevant documents, including medical evaluations that had been conducted to ensure Grandma Elena's mental competency at the time of the sale. She explained the various legal precedents that supported the validity of intra-family business transfers. Most importantly, she demonstrated that the ownership structure had been designed specifically to protect the business from the kind of family conflicts that were now playing out. Roberto's position became increasingly desperate as Patricia dismantled each of his arguments. He'd assumed that family relationships would override legal documentation, but the law was clear about property rights and contractual obligations. He'd believed that his years of service as manager gave him some claim to ownership, but the management agreement he'd signed explicitly stated that he was an employee rather than a partner. He'd hoped that Carlos's business education would provide leverage in negotiations, but academic knowledge couldn't compete with properly executed legal instruments. The final blow to Roberto's resistance came when Patricia revealed additional aspects of Grandma Elena's planning that none of us had known about. She'd created a detailed succession plan that outlined exactly how the business should be managed if family conflicts arose. This plan included specific provisions for Roberto's compensation and Carlos's potential future involvement, but both were contingent on their acceptance of my ownership and their willingness to work collaboratively rather than antagonistically. According to these previously undisclosed documents, Roberto was entitled to a generous severance package and ongoing consulting fees if he chose to step back from daily management while maintaining a positive relationship with the business. Carlos could earn a place in the company's leadership through demonstrated competence and community engagement, but not through assumptions about family privilege or educational credentials. The plan even included detailed job descriptions and performance metrics that would govern any future family employment. These revelations transformed the entire discussion. Roberto realized that his angry resistance was actually costing him financial benefits that had been designed to ease his transition from management to retirement. Carlos understood that his pathway to business leadership was still available, but only if he approached it with humility and genuine commitment to learning the industry. Both of them began to see that Grandma Elena's planning had been intended to protect everyone's interests, not just mine. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything I'd expected. Instead of fighting over control of the business, we were suddenly discussing how to implement a succession plan that had been crafted by someone who understood our family dynamics better than we understood them ourselves. Roberto's anger gave way to grudging respect for his mother's foresight. Carlos's entitlement was replaced by genuine curiosity about the business he'd assumed he could easily master. Over the following hours, we worked out an arrangement that honored both Grandma Elena's intentions and the current realities of our family situation. Roberto would transition to a consulting role, sharing his knowledge of vendor relationships and neighborhood history while stepping back from daily operations. Carlos would begin a genuine apprenticeship program, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up before assuming any leadership responsibilities. Most importantly, both of them would acknowledge my ownership and authority while contributing their own skills and perspectives to the business's continued growth. The transformation in our working relationships was immediate and dramatic. Roberto, freed from the pressure of trying to manage operations he'd never fully understood, became a valuable resource for historical knowledge and community connections. His stories about the bakery's early years provided marketing content for our social media accounts. His relationships with longtime customers created opportunities for expanded catering services. His understanding of neighborhood politics helped navigate permit processes and community event planning. Carlos, stripped of his assumptions about immediate leadership, proved surprisingly capable when he approached the work with genuine humility. His business education became useful when applied to specific operational challenges rather than abstract theories. His youth and energy contributed to efficiency improvements that enhanced rather than replaced traditional techniques. His willingness to start at entry-level positions earned him respect from longtime employees who'd been skeptical of his qualifications. The changes in our family dynamics extended beyond the workplace. Roberto began talking about the pride he felt in my accomplishments rather than the credit he deserved for enabling them. Carlos started asking questions about cultural traditions and community engagement, rather than dismissing them as inefficient sentimentality. Both of them seemed relieved to have clear roles and expectations, rather than navigating the ambiguous power structures that had created so much tension. The business itself flourished under the new arrangement. With my ownership officially recognized, I could make strategic decisions without seeking approval from people who didn't understand the industry or the community we served. The innovations I'd been developing in secret could now be implemented openly, with full support from family members who understood their value. The community relationships I'd built could be leveraged for expansion opportunities that had been impossible under the previous management structure. Within 6 months, we'd opened a second location in North Portland, specializing in traditional Mexican breakfast items for the area's growing Latino population. The original Southeast Division location became our flagship store, featuring expanded catering services and special event hosting. Our online presence grew to include cooking classes and cultural education programs that connected Portland's diverse communities with authentic Mexican culinary traditions. The financial results exceeded everyone's expectations. Revenue increased by 40% in the first year under my acknowledged ownership, driven by expanded services, improved efficiency, and stronger community engagement. Employee satisfaction improved dramatically as team members felt empowered to contribute ideas and take initiative, rather than simply following orders from managers who didn't understand their work. Customer loyalty deepened as people recognized the authentic leadership and cultural integrity that had always been present but was now officially acknowledged. Perhaps most importantly, the family relationships that had been strained by years of unclear roles and unacknowledged contributions began to heal and strengthen. Roberto found meaning in his consulting role and pride in his daughter's accomplishments. Carlos discovered genuine passion for the food industry and respect for the skills required to succeed in it. The extended family, initially confused by the revelations about ownership, came to appreciate the wisdom of Grandma Elena's planning and the fairness of the arrangements she'd created. The story of Rodriguez Family Bakery became a case study in successful family business transitions, attracting attention from business schools and industry associations. I was invited to speak at conferences about women's entrepreneurship, Latino business leadership, and intergenerational wealth building. The bakery itself became a symbol of how traditional values and modern business practices could be combined to create sustainable economic success while preserving cultural heritage. Looking back on the dramatic confrontation that had changed everything, I realized that Grandma Elena's planning had been even more sophisticated than any of us had understood. She'd anticipated not just the legal and financial challenges of business succession, but also the emotional and cultural dynamics that could either strengthen or destroy family enterprises. Her solution had protected everyone's interests while creating opportunities for growth and collaboration that wouldn't have been possible under traditional inheritance arrangements. The wooden spoons that had seemed like simple keepsakes now occupied places of honor in both bakery locations, symbols of the wisdom and love that had made our success possible. The recipes that had been passed down through generations continued to anchor our menu, but they were now complemented by innovations that honored traditional techniques while appealing to contemporary tastes. The community relationships that had sustained us through challenging times became the foundation for expansion and growth that benefited everyone involved. Roberto often told customers that he was proud to work for his daughter, a statement that would have been unthinkable during the years when family hierarchy prevented honest acknowledgement of individual contributions. Carlos frequently credited his success to the traditional knowledge he'd learned from longtime employees, recognizing that business school theory was only valuable when grounded in practical experience and cultural understanding. As for me, I discovered that owning a business legally was different from managing it effectively, but both required the same commitment to excellence, community engagement, and cultural authenticity that had guided my work from the beginning. The confidence that came from official recognition enabled me to take risks and pursue opportunities that had seemed impossible when I was working under someone else's authority, even if that authority had been more symbolic than real. The transformation from dismissed employee to acknowledged business owner had taken place over a few dramatic days. But the foundation for that transformation had been built through years of dedicated work, community engagement, and cultural preservation. Grandma Elena's legal planning had protected my interests, but my own efforts had created the value that made those protections meaningful. Today, Rodriguez Family Bakery continues to serve Southeast Portland with the same commitment to quality and community that has defined us for over 60 years. The difference is that now everyone knows who's really responsible for our continued success, and the credit goes where it's always belonged. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge is simply claiming what was always rightfully yours and using it to build something even better than what came before. 2 years after the morning I walked back into my own bakery as its rightful owner, I found myself standing before a packed auditorium at Portland State University, preparing to deliver the keynote address for Women's Entrepreneurship Week. The journey from dismissed employee to recognized business leader had been remarkable enough, but what happened next exceeded even my grandmother's ambitious vision for what the bakery could become. The invitation to speak had come from Dr. Sarah Martinez, the director of PSU's Center for Latino Business Development. She'd been following our story since the Portland Business Journal featured us in their Family Business Success Stories series. But what really caught her attention was the innovative approach we'd taken to expansion and community engagement. Rodriguez Family Bakery had become more than just a successful food business. We'd evolved into a model for how traditional enterprises could adapt to changing demographics while preserving their cultural integrity. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience of young women who reminded me of myself a decade earlier, I thought about the ripple effects that had emerged from that single dramatic confrontation in our cramped office. The immediate victory of reclaiming my business had been satisfying, but the long-term impact had been transformational in ways none of us could have anticipated. The expansion to North Portland had been our first major test as a family working under the new ownership structure. Roberto's initial skepticism about serving breakfast items had given way to enthusiasm when he saw the lines of customers waiting for our traditional Mexican morning pastries. Carlos, working his way up from prep cook to assistant manager, had proven invaluable in navigating the permits and regulations required for our second location. His business education finally found practical application in tasks like lease negotiations and health department compliance, areas where his formal training complemented rather than competed with our operational expertise. But the real breakthrough had come when we launched our community kitchen program. The idea had emerged from conversations with other Latino business owners who struggled to find commercial kitchen space for their food ventures. Our North Portland location had extra capacity during off-peak hours, and I realized we could create a shared-use program that would support other entrepreneurs while generating additional revenue for our own operations. The Community Kitchen program became a launching pad for dozens of small food businesses run by immigrant women who possessed incredible culinary skills but lacked access to proper facilities. We provided not just kitchen space but also mentorship, business planning assistance, and connections to potential customers and investors. Many of these women had been working from their home kitchens, limited by regulations and scale, but our program gave them the platform they needed to build legitimate enterprises. Watching these women succeed reminded me of my own grandmother's journey decades earlier. Elena Rodriguez had arrived in Portland with traditional skills and enormous determination, but she'd needed someone to believe in her potential and provide opportunities for growth. Now we were creating those opportunities for the next generation of immigrant entrepreneurs, continuing a cycle of empowerment that honored our cultural heritage while building economic strength for our community. The success stories were remarkable. Luz Morales, who'd been making tamales for neighborhood parties, launched a catering business that now serves corporate events throughout the metro area. Carmen Vega transformed her family's mole recipe into a packaged sauce business that's sold in specialty stores across the Pacific Northwest. Ana Gutierrez's weekend taco pop-up evolved into a full-service restaurant that employs 15 people and has become a destination for food lovers seeking authentic regional Mexican cuisine. These women's successes became our successes, creating a network of allied businesses that supported each other through challenges and celebrated each other's achievements. The relationships we built through the Community Kitchen program generated referrals, collaborative marketing opportunities, and shared resources that benefited everyone involved. More importantly, they created a sense of collective empowerment that extended far beyond individual business outcomes. The media attention that followed our community kitchen program brought unexpected opportunities. Food Network producers approached us about featuring the program in a documentary about women changing America's food landscape. The segment, which aired during Hispanic Heritage Month, introduced our story to a national audience and generated interest from other cities wanting to replicate our model. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the Portland City Council, which proclaimed an annual Elena Rodriguez Day to honor my grandmother's contributions to the city's cultural and economic development. The proclamation ceremony took place in front of our original Southeast Division location, with Roberto and Carlos standing beside me as I accepted the honor on behalf of our entire family. Mayor Wheeler spoke about the importance of immigrant entrepreneurs in building Portland's distinctive character, and local news coverage helps cement our reputation as community leaders rather than just successful business owners. The financial growth that accompanied our expanded mission was substantial, but secondary to the cultural impact we were creating. Our original location had become a pilgrimage site for food enthusiasts and a required stop for culinary tours of Portland. The recipes I'd preserved and refined were being featured in cookbooks and food magazines, spreading awareness of regional Mexican traditions that had been largely unknown outside immigrant communities. The educational component of our work had evolved naturally from customer curiosity about our techniques and ingredients. We began offering weekend cooking classes that taught traditional Mexican baking methods to home cooks who wanted to understand the cultural context behind the food they loved. These classes filled up months in advance, with participants ranging from recent immigrants wanting to connect with their heritage to longtime Portland residents seeking to broaden their culinary horizons. Carlos had found his calling as our head instructor for these educational programs. His business background helped him structure the classes professionally, while his genuine respect for traditional techniques made him an effective teacher. Watching him demonstrate the proper way to work masa for tortillas or explain the regional variations in mole preparation, I could see how much he'd grown from the entitled business school graduate who'd once dismissed our methods as inefficient. Roberto's role had evolved as well, transforming from reluctant manager to enthusiastic ambassador for our family's history. He'd become our primary storyteller, sharing memories of Elena's early struggles and celebrating the neighborhood relationships that had sustained us through difficult periods. His presence at community events and his willingness to discuss our family's journey added authenticity to our public relations efforts that no marketing strategy could have achieved. The healing of our family relationships had been gradual but profound. The tensions that had built up over years of unclear roles and unacknowledged contributions had dissolved once everyone understood their place in our shared enterprise. Roberto found dignity in his consulting role and pride in supporting my leadership rather than competing with it. Carlos discovered satisfaction in earning his position through merit rather than assuming it through family connections. Our success had also attracted attention from business schools and entrepreneurship programs interested in studying our transition model. Patricia Morrison, the attorney who'd guided us through the initial crisis, was invited to co-author a case study about family business succession planning that's now used in law schools across the country. The legal framework my grandmother had created had become a template for other families navigating similar challenges. The invitations to speak at conferences and business forums had multiplied as our story spread beyond Portland's food scene. I'd addressed audiences at the National Restaurant Association convention, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce annual meeting, and several university entrepreneurship programs. Each speaking engagement provided opportunities to share not just our business strategies, but also the cultural values that had guided our decisions. The most rewarding aspect of these speaking opportunities was meeting other women who'd faced similar challenges in family businesses or male-dominated industries. Their stories reminded me that the issues we'd confronted, gender bias, generational conflicts, cultural preservation in changing markets, were common experiences that required both individual courage and systemic change to address effectively. One particularly memorable conversation took place after a presentation at the International Women's Entrepreneurship Forum in Seattle. A young Korean-American woman approached me with tears in her eyes, explaining that her family's restaurant was facing succession challenges remarkably similar to what we'd experienced. Her contributions to the business's modernization and growth were being dismissed by male relatives who assumed their educational credentials and cultural authority made them better suited for leadership. I spent 2 hours with her that evening, sharing not just our specific strategies, but also the emotional journey of learning to advocate for myself within family structures that hadn't been designed to recognize women's leadership capabilities. We exchanged contact information, and I was able to connect her with Patricia Morrison for legal guidance. 6 months later, she sent me photos from the grand opening of her family's second location, where she was officially recognized as the owner-operator. These personal connections multiplied over time, creating an informal network of women supporting each other through similar challenges. The relationships that began with conference conversations evolved into ongoing mentorship relationships, business partnerships, and collaborative advocacy for policy changes that would support women-owned enterprises. The policy advocacy work had emerged naturally from our growing visibility and the platform that came with media attention. I began testifying at city council meetings about zoning regulations that affected small food businesses. I participated in task forces examining barriers to entrepreneurship in immigrant communities. I lobbied state legislators about licensing requirements that disproportionately impacted women-owned enterprises. This advocacy work connected me with other business leaders who were using their success to create broader change. Together, we formed the Pacific Northwest Women's Business Alliance, a coalition focused on policy reform, resource sharing, and mutual support. The alliance has successfully advocated for changes in small business lending practices, zoning restrictions, and professional licensing requirements that had been barriers to women's economic advancement. The educational initiatives had expanded beyond cooking classes to include business mentorship programs for women seeking to start food-related enterprises. We partnered with Portland Community College to offer a certificate program in food entrepreneurship that combined practical skills with business planning and cultural competency training. I served on the curriculum committee and taught sessions about community engagement and authentic marketing. The scholarship program we'd established in Elena's memory had supported 43 students pursuing culinary or business education over the past 2 years. Recipients weren't just from Latino families. We'd deliberately created criteria that supported any student demonstrating financial need, academic promise, and commitment to using their education for community benefit. Several scholarship recipients had completed internships at our bakeries, with 3 eventually becoming full-time employees. The most ambitious project we'd undertaken was the development of a cooperative marketplace for immigrant food entrepreneurs. The idea had grown from the success of our community kitchen program and the recognition that many participants needed not just production space but also retail opportunities. We'd purchased and renovated a former grocery store in Southeast Portland, creating individual vendor spaces for small food businesses alongside a shared seating area and community event space. The cooperative marketplace, which we named Mercado Elena, in honor of my grandmother, had become a destination for food lovers seeking authentic cuisine from across Latin America. Vendors offered everything from Salvadoran pupusas to Peruvian ceviche to Colombian arepas, creating a diverse food hall that celebrated the region's immigrant communities while providing economic opportunities for dozens of families. My role in managing the cooperative had required skills I'd never anticipated needing: mediating disputes between vendors, coordinating marketing efforts across multiple businesses, and ensuring compliance with complex health department regulations for a multi-vendor facility had challenged me in ways that single-location bakery management never had. But the work was deeply satisfying because it directly supported other women's entrepreneurial dreams while creating something unprecedented in Portland's food scene. The success of Mercado Elena had attracted national attention from urban planners and economic development specialists interested in replicable models for supporting immigrant entrepreneurship. Delegations from other cities had visited to study our approach, and we'd consulted on similar projects in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Phoenix. The consulting fees from these projects had provided additional revenue that we'd reinvested in expanding our scholarship and mentorship programs. Roberto had become an unexpected asset in these consulting engagements, sharing his perspective on how traditional family business structures could be adapted to support women's leadership without abandoning cultural values that emphasized family unity and intergenerational respect. His evolution from skeptical manager to enthusiastic advocate had resonated with other family business leaders struggling to navigate similar transitions. Carlos had also found opportunities beyond our direct operations, completing an MBA program with a focus on social entrepreneurship and accepting a position with a nonprofit organization that supported Latino business development throughout Oregon. His experience working his way up through our operations had given him credibility with other business owners that his original academic credentials alone couldn't have provided. The ripple effects of our family's transformation had extended into our personal relationships as well. Roberto's marriage had strengthened as he found new purpose in supporting community development, rather than struggling with business responsibilities he'd never fully embraced. Carlos had married his longtime girlfriend, and their wedding reception featured catering from multiple Mercado Elena vendors, symbolizing the extended business family we'd created. My own life had been transformed in ways that went far beyond professional success. The confidence that came from being recognized as a legitimate business leader had enabled me to pursue romantic relationships without the insecurity that had plagued me when my professional identity was uncertain. I'd started dating Miguel Torres, a social worker who specialized in immigrant family services, and our relationship had been built on mutual respect for each other's community-focused work. The speaking engagement at Portland State represented a milestone in my journey, from invisible contributor to recognized leader. Dr. Martinez had specifically requested that I address the psychological and emotional challenges of advocating for yourself within family and cultural structures that might not immediately recognize your capabilities. The audience included not just business students but also young women from immigrant families who were navigating similar tensions between traditional expectations and contemporary opportunities. My presentation focused on 3 key lessons from our experience. First, that documentation and legal protection were essential, even within family relationships, not because family members were inherently untrustworthy, but because clear agreements prevented misunderstandings that could damage both business and personal relationships. Second, that cultural preservation and business innovation weren't opposing forces but rather complementary strategies that could strengthen both traditional values and economic success. Third, that individual achievement was most meaningful when it created opportunities for others facing similar challenges. The question and answer session that followed was energetic and emotional. Young women shared stories about their own family business conflicts, their struggles to balance cultural expectations with personal ambitions, and their concerns about whether success required abandoning traditional values. The conversations reminded me of my own uncertainties during the years when I was building the bakery's success without receiving recognition for my contributions. One question particularly resonated with me. A senior business student asked how I'd maintained my emotional connection to the business during the period when my ownership was unrecognized and my contributions were attributed to others. The question forced me to reflect on the internal resources that had sustained me through those challenging years. My answer emphasized the importance of finding meaning in the work itself, rather than depending solely on external recognition. The satisfaction of creating something beautiful and useful, the joy of serving customers who appreciated our products, the pride of preserving cultural traditions for future generations, these intrinsic rewards had sustained me, even when the extrinsic rewards of ownership and recognition were absent. But I also acknowledged that internal motivation alone wasn't sufficient for long-term sustainability. Eventually, everyone needed their contributions to be acknowledged, and their authority to be respected. The legal framework my grandmother had created had been essential, not just for protecting my interests, but also for my psychological well-being as a business leader. The presentation concluded with an invitation for audience members to visit our operations and learn more about the programs we'd developed. Several students followed up with internship applications, and one young woman approached me afterward to discuss her idea for a catering business specializing in Central American cuisine. These connections reminded me that our success was most valuable when it inspired and enabled others to pursue their own entrepreneurial dreams. Driving home from the university, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that morning when Roberto had attempted to fire me from my own business. The legal victory had been important, but the personal transformation had been even more significant. I'd evolved from someone who sought approval and recognition from others to someone who created opportunities and recognition for others. The bakery that had been my grandmother's legacy had become the foundation for my own legacy. The recipes and techniques Elena had preserved were now being shared with a new generation of food entrepreneurs. The community relationships she'd built were being strengthened and expanded through our various programs. The economic success she'd achieved was being multiplied through the businesses we'd helped launch and support. But perhaps most importantly, the values she'd embodied, hard work, cultural pride, community service, family loyalty, were being expressed in contemporary forms that honored traditional principles while addressing modern challenges. The legal documents she'd crafted to protect my interests had become tools for empowering other women facing similar struggles. As I pulled into the parking space behind our original Southeast Division location, I saw the lights still on in the kitchen where Maria was preparing tomorrow's pastries. The familiar sight reminded me that despite all the expansion and recognition, the heart of our enterprise remained the daily work of creating something beautiful and nourishing for our community. Elena Rodriguez had arrived in Portland 60 years ago with nothing but traditional skills and fierce determination. Today, her granddaughter stood before university audiences sharing strategies for building businesses that honored cultural heritage while creating economic opportunity. The transformation had taken 3 generations to complete, but the foundation she'd laid had made everything else possible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. There were expansion possibilities to evaluate, scholarship recipients to mentor, and policy initiatives to support. But tonight, I was content to walk through the bakery that had become so much more than my grandmother had ever imagined, while still remaining true to everything she'd valued. The wooden spoons that hung on the kitchen wall were no longer just family heirlooms. They were symbols of a legacy that continued to grow and evolve with each passing day. The recipes that filled our menu boards represented not just traditional techniques, but also the creativity and innovation that came from respecting the past while embracing the future. The community that gathered in our dining areas reflected not just commercial success but also the deep human connections that made business meaningful. Standing in the kitchen where my journey had begun, I understood that my grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the legal documents that protected my ownership, or even the business that provided my livelihood. Her greatest gift had been the example of how to build something that served others while expressing your authentic self. How to create success that lifted up your entire community, while staying true to your deepest values. That legacy would continue long after I was gone, carried forward by the women we'd mentored, the businesses we'd supported, and the community we'd helped strengthen. The story that had begun with my grandmother's courage to start over in a new country would continue with each scholarship recipient who pursued their dreams, each vendor who launched their business at Mercado Elena, and each young woman who learned that ownership and leadership were rights to be claimed rather than privileges to be granted by others. 5 years after I discovered those life-changing documents in Patricia Morrison's office, I stood in the gleaming corporate boardroom of Meridian Foods, one of the largest food distribution companies on the West Coast. The mahogany table was surrounded by executives in expensive suits, all of them studying the acquisition proposal I'd just presented with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed amazement. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now the one making offers to buy other people's businesses. The meeting had been months in the making, but its origins traced back to a conversation I'd had with Maria during one of our late-night baking sessions. She'd mentioned her frustration with the limited distribution options available to small Latino food producers, many of whom created exceptional products but lacked access to major retail chains. The big distributors weren't interested in small batch producers, while the small distributors lacked the infrastructure to reach significant markets. That conversation had planted a seed that grew into Rodriguez Distribution Network, our latest venture into food industry logistics. Rather than simply expanding our bakery operations, we decided to create the infrastructure that other immigrant food entrepreneurs needed to scale their businesses. The acquisition of Meridian's regional distribution arm would give us the warehousing, transportation, and retail relationships necessary to bring dozens of small producers into mainstream markets. The Meridian executives had initially been skeptical when our proposal arrived. A bakery owner wanting to purchase their distribution division seemed like a fantasy rather than a serious business proposition. But the financial backing we'd assembled through our success, and the strategic plan we'd developed with our expanded team of advisors, had convinced them to take the meeting seriously. Leading the presentation, I explained how our distribution network would specialize in authentic ethnic foods produced by immigrant-owned businesses. Unlike traditional distributors who focused solely on volume and profit margins, we would provide comprehensive support, including packaging consultation, marketing assistance, and quality certification. Our goal wasn't just to move products, but to build sustainable businesses that could compete in mainstream markets while maintaining their cultural authenticity. The financial projections were compelling because they were based on real market data from our existing relationships. Through Mercado Elena and our community kitchen program, we'd identified more than 200 small food producers who were ready to scale their operations if they had access to proper distribution channels. Our research had also revealed growing consumer demand for authentic ethnic foods, particularly among younger demographics who valued cultural exploration and artisanal quality. Carlos had played a crucial role in developing the acquisition strategy, his MBA education finally finding perfect application in the complex financial modeling required for such a significant transaction. His transformation from entitled family member to capable business strategist had been complete, and his presentation of our growth projections impressed even the most skeptical Meridian executives. The due diligence process had taken 3 months, during which teams of lawyers and accountants examined every aspect of both companies. Patricia Morrison had assembled a formidable legal team to handle the transaction, while we'd brought in specialized consultants to evaluate Meridian's infrastructure and customer relationships. The complexity of the deal far exceeded anything our family had ever attempted, but our success with smaller acquisitions had prepared us for the challenges involved. Roberto had surprised everyone by becoming one of our most effective ambassadors during the acquisition process. His decades of experience in Portland's Latino business community gave him credibility with potential partners and investors that formal presentations couldn't achieve. When nervous suppliers questioned whether we could handle their accounts professionally, Roberto's personal assurances carried more weight than any corporate guarantee. The financing for the acquisition had come from multiple sources, reflecting the diverse network of supporters we'd built over the years. Traditional bank loans provided the foundation, but we'd also secured investments from several family foundations interested in supporting immigrant entrepreneurship. The Small Business Administration had provided loan guarantees, and we'd even attracted interest from impact investors who saw our social mission as complementary to their financial goals. Most unexpectedly, we'd received a significant investment from 3 of the women who'd launched successful businesses through our community kitchen program. Luz Morales, whose tamale catering business had grown into a regional operation, had insisted on becoming a limited partner in the distribution venture. Carmen Vega's sauce company was now profitable enough for her to invest in infrastructure that would benefit other producers. Ana Gutierrez had sold her restaurant chain to a larger company and wanted to reinvest her proceeds in supporting the next generation of food entrepreneurs. The symbolism of these investments was profound. Women who'd started their businesses in our shared kitchen space were now financially supporting our expansion into food distribution. The network effect we'd created was generating its own momentum, with successful entrepreneurs using their achievements to enable others to follow similar paths. The negotiation with Meridian had been lengthy and complex, but ultimately successful because both sides recognized the mutual benefits involved. Meridian's executives appreciated our deep understanding of the ethnic food market and our established relationships with producers they'd been unable to reach. We valued their existing infrastructure and customer relationships, which would allow us to scale our operations far more quickly than building everything from scratch. The acquisition announcement had generated significant media attention, with food industry publications highlighting the unusual trajectory from family bakery to major food distributor. Business journals focused on our innovative approach to supporting immigrant entrepreneurs, while trade magazines examined the potential market disruption our specialized distribution model might create. The attention had also attracted interest from other cities, where Latino business leaders were facing similar challenges with distribution and market access. We'd received inquiries from Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Denver about potentially franchising our model or providing consulting services for similar ventures. The scope of opportunity was both exciting and daunting, requiring us to think strategically about how quickly we wanted to expand and how to maintain our core values while scaling our operations. Managing the integration of Meridian's operations with our existing businesses required skills none of us had possessed when we'd started this journey. We'd hired experienced executives from major food companies to handle logistics and operations, while maintaining our commitment to personal relationships and community engagement. The challenge was creating systems that could handle significant volume while preserving the individual attention that had made our smaller operations successful. The warehouse facility we'd acquired through the Meridian purchase was located in an industrial area of southeast Portland, just 15 minutes from our original bakery location. Walking through the vast space filled with loading docks, refrigeration units, and inventory management systems, I was struck by how far we'd traveled from the cramped office where Roberto had once tried to fire me. The facility's transformation reflected our values and mission in ways that traditional warehouses never had. We'd designated specific areas for small producers to store their products and conduct quality control testing. We'd created a demonstration kitchen where potential retail customers could sample products before placing orders. We'd even installed cultural artwork and bilingual signage that made the space welcoming to the immigrant entrepreneurs who would be our primary clients. The first major test of our distribution capabilities came when we secured a contract to supply authentic Mexican products to a regional grocery chain with 47 locations across Oregon and Washington. The order volume was larger than anything most of our producers had ever attempted, requiring us to coordinate production schedules, quality standards, and delivery logistics across dozens of small businesses. Maria had taken on the role of quality assurance coordinator, working with each producer to ensure their products met retail standards while maintaining the authenticity that made them special. Her background in traditional food preparation, combined with her years of experience in commercial food production, made her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between artisanal methods and industrial requirements. The grocery chain contract had generated immediate success stories that validated our entire approach. Carmen Vega's mole sauce, which had previously been available only at farmers markets and specialty stores, was now being discovered by mainstream consumers throughout the Pacific Northwest. Her sales increased by 400% in the first quarter, requiring her to hire additional staff and invest in expanded production equipment. Similar success stories emerged across our producer network. A Guatemalan woman's exceptional hot sauce gained distribution to restaurants throughout Portland's food scene. A Salvador American family's unique cheese products found their way into upscale delicatessens. A Honduran baker's traditional sweetbreads became available in suburban grocery stores, where Latino families had previously been unable to find authentic options. The economic impact extended beyond individual business success to broader community development. The increased income generated by our distribution network enabled families to invest in education, housing, and additional business ventures. Several producers had been able to move from shared commercial kitchen space to their own dedicated facilities. Others had hired employees from their communities, creating jobs that paid significantly better than typical entry-level positions. The social impact was equally significant. Mainstream consumers were being introduced to authentic foods and flavors they'd never encountered, fostering cultural appreciation and understanding. Latino families were finding familiar products in convenient locations, strengthening their connections to their cultural heritage. The success of immigrant-owned businesses was challenging stereotypes and demonstrating the economic contributions that diverse communities could make. Our expansion had also created opportunities for the next generation of Latino business leaders. We'd established an internship program that brought business students into our operations, providing practical experience in food industry logistics while exposing them to entrepreneurial possibilities they might not have considered. Several interns had developed their own business ideas and were now participants in our community kitchen program. The mentorship component of our work had evolved into a formal accelerator program that provided intensive business development support to promising food entrepreneurs. Participants received 6 months of training in business planning, marketing, financial management, and industry regulations, along with access to our commercial kitchen facilities and potential inclusion in our distribution network. The accelerator program had attracted support from Portland State University's Business School, which provided academic credit for students who participated as mentors and consultants. The partnership created a pipeline of bilingual, culturally competent business advisors who understood both traditional food production methods and contemporary market requirements. One of the most rewarding aspects of our expanded operations was the opportunity to work with second-generation immigrants who wanted to honor their family's culinary traditions while building modern businesses. These young entrepreneurs brought energy, education, and technological sophistication to traditional food production, creating products that appealed to both their cultural communities and mainstream markets. Elena Sandoval, whose grandmother had taught her to make traditional Oaxacan chocolate, had developed a line of artisanal chocolate bars that incorporated ancient techniques with contemporary flavors. Her products were now sold in high-end grocery stores and specialty shops throughout the region, generating enough revenue for her to support her grandmother's retirement and expand the family's recipe collection. Miguel Hernandez had transformed his father's weekend barbacoa operation into a packaged meat product business that supplied restaurants and grocery stores with authentic slow-cooked meats. His innovation was developing preservation and packaging methods that maintained traditional flavors while meeting commercial food safety requirements. These success stories were being documented by food journalists and business reporters, who were fascinated by the intersection of cultural preservation and economic innovation. Our work had been featured in Food and Wine magazine, Entrepreneur, and Hispanic Business, with each article generating additional interest from potential producers and investors. The recognition had also brought speaking invitations from unexpected sources. I'd addressed the National Restaurant Association about authentic ingredient sourcing, spoken at the Specialty Food Association conference about supporting immigrant food producers, and participated in a White House forum on small business development in underserved communities. Each speaking engagement provided opportunities to advocate for policy changes that would support immigrant entrepreneurship more broadly. I testified before congressional committees about the barriers that prevented talented food producers from accessing mainstream markets, including licensing requirements, inspection protocols, and distribution challenges that disproportionately affected small businesses. The policy advocacy work had connected me with other business leaders who were using their success to influence systemic change. Together, we'd formed coalitions that successfully lobbied for streamlined licensing procedures, expanded access to commercial kitchen space, and increased funding for small business development programs in immigrant communities. The personal satisfaction of this work went far beyond financial success or public recognition. Every week brought new evidence that our efforts were creating lasting positive change in people's lives. Former participants in our programs were starting their own businesses, hiring employees, and contributing to their community's economic development. The transformation of my own role had been equally dramatic. I'd evolved from someone seeking recognition for my contributions to someone creating opportunities for others to make their own contributions. The confidence that had come from claiming my rightful place as a business owner had enabled me to take increasingly ambitious risks in service of broader goals. My relationship with Miguel Torres had deepened as we'd worked together on various community development initiatives. His expertise in social services complemented my business experience, and we'd collaborated on programs that addressed not just economic challenges but also the social and cultural barriers that prevented immigrant families from fully participating in economic opportunities. Our engagement had been announced in the same Portland Business Journal article that featured our latest expansion plans. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us that we'd found love while pursuing shared commitments to community service and social justice. Our wedding, planned for the following spring, would take place at Mercado Elena with catering provided by the women who'd launched their businesses through our programs. Roberto's pride in our achievements had been one of the most gratifying aspects of our family's journey. He'd become our most enthusiastic ambassador, speaking at community events about the importance of supporting women's leadership and sharing stories about Elena's original vision for the bakery. His evolution from skeptical manager to proud supporter had demonstrated the possibility of personal growth and family healing, even in the most challenging circumstances. Carlos had found his calling in the intersection of business strategy and social impact. His role in our distribution network had prepared him for acceptance into a prestigious graduate program in social entrepreneurship at Stanford, where he was developing research on immigrant business development that would inform policy recommendations for other regions. The academic recognition of our work had been unexpected but meaningful. Business schools were incorporating case studies based on our succession planning and expansion strategies into their curricula. Our legal structure had been cited in law review articles about family business transitions. Our community development model was being studied by urban planning programs as an example of culturally responsive economic development. Looking back on the morning when I'd discovered my ownership documents, I realized that the legal victory had been just the beginning of a much larger transformation. The papers that Patricia Morrison had shown me had given me the authority to reclaim my business, but the real work had been learning to use that authority in service of something larger than personal success. Elena Rodriguez's vision for a neighborhood bakery that served her community with pride and authenticity had evolved into a network of businesses and programs that was transforming how Latino food producers accessed mainstream markets. Her determination to preserve cultural traditions while adapting to new opportunities had become a model for how immigrant entrepreneurs could honor their heritage while building economic security for their families. The wooden spoons that had traveled from Mexico to Portland in Elena's suitcase now occupied a place of honor in our corporate headquarters, symbols of a journey that had taken 3 generations to complete, but that would continue for generations to come. The recipes she'd preserved were now being shared with thousands of consumers who were discovering authentic flavors for the first time. The community relationships she'd built were now being replicated in markets across the country, where our distribution network was creating opportunities for other immigrant food producers. Standing in the boardroom where we'd just signed the papers finalizing our largest acquisition, I thought about the young woman who'd once mixed bread dough in the pre-dawn darkness, wondering if her contributions would ever be recognized or valued. That woman had become someone who created recognition and value for others, someone whose success enabled dozens of other women to build their own businesses and pursue their own dreams. The circle that had begun with Elena's courage to start over in a new country was now complete, but it was also continuing to expand with each new entrepreneur we supported, each new market we opened, and each new generation of leaders we inspired. The legacy that had started with a single bakery was now transforming an entire industry, and the story was far from over. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.